Welcome to your personalized deep dive. You shared some excerpts from a religious study guide, and it's focused on the Last Supper. And even just skimming through it, I was like, wow, there's a lot to unpack here.
Yeah, it's a rich text for sure. And it's so fascinating how it uses the Last Supper as a jumping off point to explore these really profound theological concepts.
Exactly. So today we are diving into, those key takeaways, like the comforting promises that Jesus gave to his disciples and how this new covenant all about and how this ancient meal still speaks to us, like today.
I think what's so unique about this study guide is the emphasis on the Last Supper as a Passover meal. It's prompting us to think about the connections between the old and the new, the freedom from slavery in Egypt and this new kind of freedom that's offered through Jesus.
I noticed that too. It kept referencing those passages from Jeremiah and Ezekiel talking about this new covenant. And to be honest, that's one of those terms I've always kind of heard, but never really fully grasped. So could you break that down a little bit for me?
Absolutely. So the idea of a covenant is actually central to understanding the Bible. So in essence, it's a binding agreement between God and his people. So the Old Covenant was established with Moses, and it was based on the law. But the prophets, like Jeremiah and Ezekiel, they foretold a new covenant one where God's law would be written on hearts, not just on tablets of stone.
So it's less about external rules and more about an internal transformation.
Exactly. Yeah,
Okay.
it's a radical shift. And the study guide really emphasizes the provisions of this new covenant. Things like forgiveness of sins and not just remembering them no more, but
Okay.
truly being cleansed from them. And the idea of God's Spirit dwelling within us, not just residing in a temple.
That's a powerful image, God's Spirit actually within us. And it makes me think about that question that the guide poses at the very beginning. What promise would bring you comfort if you were actually in the disciples' shoes?
Yeah, it's a brilliant prompt because it immediately puts us right there in that upper room with Jesus and his disciples, right? They're facing an uncertain future, their leader is about to be arrested and the world around them just feels hostile, yet Jesus offers them these just incredible promises.
And it's not just vague promises either.
Yeah.
He's incredibly specific.
Hmm.
I go to prepare a place for you. I will come back again and I will take you to myself. I can see how in that moment those words would have been incredibly comforting.
Absolutely. But what's interesting is that the guide doesn't just present those promises as a feel-good message. It actually encourages us to grapple with the complexities, especially when we look at the different descriptions of Jesus's return.
You're talking about how John's gospel describes a more personal return, where Jesus comes to take his followers to be with him, while Matthew paints this much more dramatic picture of a visible cosmic return.
Yes, exactly. It's fascinating to see how these two seemingly different accounts are presented side by side. It encourages us to think about what each version might be emphasizing and how they might inform our understanding of Jesus's ultimate victory.
When I think about those contrasting descriptions, I'm struck by how we often long for that dramatic comeback moment in our own lives, that big change that fixes everything. But John's account suggests a much quieter, more personal kind of return.
That's a really insightful observation, and it makes me wonder if both of these perspectives might be necessary, the longing for justice and restoration on this grand scale, and the recognition that true transformation often happens in those quieter, more personal encounters with Jesus.
And maybe that's where the Holy Spirit comes in. The guy spends quite a bit of time highlighting John 14, where Jesus promises to send the Holy Spirit as a comforter and guide. And it is just an activity where we highlight specific words and phrases that describe the Holy Spirit's nature and actions.
Oh, I love that activity. It forces us to slow down and really pay attention to the language that's being used. We see the Holy Spirit described as an advocate, a counselor, someone who teaches us and reminds us of all that Jesus said. It's an incredibly intimate and empowering portrayal.
I'm struck by how the guide uses the image of a childhood security blanket to explain such a complex theological concept.
It's brilliant, isn't it? Because it taps into that universal human need for comfort and security, especially in times of fear and uncertainty. It's suggesting that the Holy Spirit isn't some distant abstract force, but a very real presence that can offer us that same kind of solace and reassurance.
Okay, so we've got these incredible promises, this new covenant that reshapes our relationship with God, and this powerful presence of the Holy Spirit guiding us and comforting us. It's a lot to take in, but the guide doesn't just stop there, does it?
No, it doesn't, and that's what makes it so engaging. It goes beyond just presenting information and offers all these different ways to experience and interact with these ideas.
Yeah, it really dives into the art Symbolism even suggests that we analyze Da Vinci's Last Supper painting. And, I've seen that painting countless times, but I've never really considered it in light of these teachings about like the new covenant and the Holy Spirit.
That's where this guide shines. It pushes us beyond just like passive learning and into active engagement.
Yeah.
You're not just like reading about the Last Supper. You're like experiencing it through art, through discussion, even through personal reflection. I remember that suggestion about like childhood security blankets. I think that was surprisingly profound.
Yeah, me too. It's not just a cute analogy. It actually gets at something really deep about our need for comfort and for security and how that like connects to our relationship with God.
Right. And it helps us understand that theological concepts aren't just abstract ideas. They're about real human experiences. And that brings us to something we haven't like touched on yet. The guide's emphasis on like remembering the provisions of the new covenant, particularly during communion.
That's interesting. I've always thought of communion as this symbolic act, but I've never really considered it in light of the new covenant.
It's easy to get caught up in the ritual, but the guide is like pushing us to go deeper. It's saying, hey, remember those incredible promises that we talked about? The forgiveness, the transformation, the indwelling of God's Spirit. Those are the things we're celebrating and participating in when we share communion.
So it's not just about remembering the past, it's about experiencing the reality of the new covenant, like in the present moment.
Precisely. It's about taking those ancient promises and applying them to our lives today. And the guide is very intentional about pointing out that these provisions aren't just for a select few, they're for everyone.
That stood out to me too, how it emphasized both like the national and the personal aspects of the new covenant.
Yeah.
There are provisions specifically for the Jewish people fulfilling God's promises to Israel, but there are also provisions that apply to every individual who enters into this covenant relationship with God.
That's the beauty of it. It's a both-hand situation. God is faithful to his promises to his chosen people, but his love and grace extend far beyond any one nation or group.
Yeah, it makes me think about how this study guide seamlessly blends like the historical with the deeply personal. We're talking about events that happened thousands of years ago, yet the questions it raises, the promises it offers, they feel incredibly relevant to our lives today.
I couldn't agree more, and that's why I find that prompt at the beginning so compelling. What promise would bring you comfort if you were in the disciples' shoes? It forces us to confront our own fears, our own uncertainties, and then explore how the promises of Jesus might speak to those like very real human experiences.
That challenge to step into the disciples' shoes really resonated with me. And it made me wonder, if Jesus were sitting here with us today, what promises would he offer us in this particular moment?
That's such a powerful question. It reminds me of something else the guide touches on, the idea of Jesus not just coming back for us, but also coming to us through the presence of the Holy Spirit, that ongoing relationship, that sense of never being truly alone. That's a promise that speaks to our deepest longings, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely. And it's not just about our individual needs, is it? This whole idea of a new covenant of God's Spirit dwelling within us. It has implications for how we relate to each other, how we build community, how we engage with the world around us.
You're absolutely right. If God's law is truly written on our hearts, if we're experiencing the forgiveness and transformation that comes with the new covenant, then that should be evident in our actions, in our relationships, in the way we treat each other. It's about like living out the reality of that covenant in every aspect of our lives.
It's almost like the Last Supper becomes a blueprint for a new way of being in the world. And the guide, with its emphasis on active engagement and personal reflection, it provides us with the tools we need to actually build that new world brick by brick, promise by promise.
I love that imagery. And it's so true. We're not just like passive recipients of this new covenant. We're active participants in its ongoing fulfillment.
That brings to mind all the activities and suggestions in the guide, analyzing art, discussing personal experiences, using tools like those chronobible cards to summarize and review like key concepts. It's about making these ancient truths come alive, making them relevant and applicable to our lives today.
It's easy to dismiss something like the Last Supper as like a historical event, something that happened long ago and has little bearing on our lives today. But this guide does like a brilliant job of bridging that gap, showing us how this ancient story still has the power to shape us and transform us.
I have to agree. Going through this guide with you has been incredibly insightful. I feel like I'm seeing the Last Supper and this whole concept of the new covenant with like fresh eyes.
Me too. And that's why I think this deep dive has been so valuable. It's not just about acquiring knowledge. It's about like having an experience, a conversation that allows us to grapple with these profound truths and discover their relevance for our lives today.
Wow, it's amazing how much depth we've uncovered. It seemed like kind of a simple study guide at first glance
Yeah.
from the historical context of the Last Supper as a Passover meal. Those powerful promises that Jesus gave to those contrasting descriptions of his return and like the ongoing role of the Holy Spirit there is just so much to consider.
It really is remarkable how this guide weaves all those threads together, And it's made me realize how much I've just taken the idea of the new covenant for granted. It's not just like a theological concept, it's a whole new way of relating to God, like a complete paradigm shift.
Yeah, I was struck by that too, how it challenged like my assumptions about what it even means to be in covenant with God.
Yeah.
It's not just about like following rules, it's about experiencing transformation from the inside out.
Exactly. And it's
Mhm.
about that promise of God's law being written on our hearts, not just imposed from the outside. And the guide's suggestion to visualize like a world cleansed of idols. It's an incredibly powerful invitation to examine our own lives and see where we might be placing things ahead of our relationship with God.
When I think about a world cleansed of idols, it's not just about statues or physical objects, it's about those internal idols that we often cling to. Things like power, control, success, even like approval from others.
That's a really insightful observation, and those internal idols can be even more insidious because they're harder to detect. But the promise of the new covenant is that we can be cleansed from those too, that God's Spirit can work within us to break the chains of those addictions and free us to live in true freedom.
That brings me back to that initial prompt, what promise would bring you comfort if you were in the disciples' shoes? I'm realizing that the promise that I need most is that promise of freedom. Freedom from fear, from doubt, from those internal idols that kind of hold me captive.
That's a beautiful articulation, and I think it speaks to the universality of this message. No matter who we are, what our backgrounds are, we all long for that kind of freedom, that deep sense of peace and wholeness that comes from knowing that we are loved and accepted by God just as we are.
And that's what makes the Last Supper such a powerful and enduring symbol, isn't it? It's a reminder that no matter how messed up we might feel, no matter how many mistakes we've made, we're always welcome at the table.
Absolutely. The Last Supper was a moment of radical inclusivity, a celebration of God's boundless love and grace extended to all who are willing to receive it.
It makes me think about the way many Christians practice communion today. It's a tangible way to connect with those promises, to remember the sacrifice that Jesus made, and to experience the reality of the new covenant in a very personal way.
Yeah, and the guide encourages us to do just that, to not let communion become like this rote ritual, but to truly engage with it, to meditate on the meaning of the broken bread and the poured out wine, to remember the provisions of the new covenant, to allow those truths to shape and transform our lives.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, I'm left with a sense of both awe and responsibility, awe at the magnitude of what Jesus accomplished through his death and resurrection, and responsibility for how I choose to live in light of those truths.
I share that sentiment. It's easy to get caught up in the intellectual or historical aspects of these teachings, but ultimately it comes down to this. How will we allow the reality of the new covenant to shape our lives, our relationships, our actions in the world?
We talked a lot about the promises that Jesus gave to his disciples, but what promises might we need to make to each other today to create a sense of comfort and belonging in a world that often feels hostile and divided? That's something I'm going to be pondering for a long time.
That's a beautiful and challenging thought to leave us with, and it speaks to the enduring power of the story. It's not just about the past, it's about the present, and it's about the future that we are called to create together, a future built on love, grace, and the unshakable promises of God.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. May this exploration inspire you to delve deeper into the riches of the new covenant and discover its power to transform your own life.